and climate change. Actions to mitigate one should not worsen the other. Welcome to this Nordic Council of Ministers event. This afternoon we will debate the balancing of needs and synergies between nature and climate. My name is Jona Olafsøtter and I am coordinating this program on nature-based solutions for the Nordic Council of Ministers. This event is also coordinated by Sigga Jacobsen in the back. She is a coordinator for the Nordic Working Group on Biodiversity, and Emma Turki and Natja Christensen, Danish youth delegates to UN for Environment and Climate. I will present the program of this event. In the first part, we have a panel that will consider dilemmas of balancing conservation and protections whilst building offshore wind parks for renewable energy. In the second part of this event, we will focus on nature-based solutions. First, we will have a short video on nature-based solutions in general and this specific program, followed by a presentation by Lars Dinesen on 8 cases and 10 policy options from the Nordic countries. And concluding, we will have a panel debate where officials share their insights and lessons learned so far regarding nature-based solutions. So we're starting with this panel debate, and the moderator is Emma Turki. Welcome, Emma. The floor is yours.
Thank you for being such a good collaborator in arranging this event today. So now we will start with the first part of the event, a panel debate about how we can balance when we have to upscale the renewable energy as an important step in solving the climate crisis, but whilst also having to take care of not ruining and damaging biodiversity even further. And to start off this debate, we're going to first have a short commentary by Dean Cooper, who works from WWF and is the lead on transformation on energy sector. And afterwards, we'll have a panel debate where we will have Thomas Anker Christensen, who is the climate ambassador from Denmark. We'll have Natja Christensen, who is a Danish youth delegate. We'll have Yuri Artioli, who researches on spatial planning at sea. And lastly, we will also have Morten Dyrholm, who is the vice president at Vestas, which is one of the biggest wind turbine companies right now. But first, I want to start with Dean Cooper, who's going to give us a short introduction to why this topic is so important and something we need to consider when we do this upscaling of renewable energy. So take it away, Dean.
Great, thanks very much, Emma. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Is the mic okay there?
Yes, go.
Yeah, excellent. All right, well, thanks very much. So let me start by saying, around the world, people are realizing that we can't address biodiversity loss without tackling climate change, which requires clean energy solutions. But it's equally impossible to tackle climate change without addressing biodiversity loss. So protecting and restoring ecosystems can help us to reduce the extent of climate change and cope with its impact. So we need some real focus on biodiversity whenever we're planning new clean energy options, including offshore wind. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to ask each member of the audience to consider your own position regarding this critical link between climate, energy, and nature. So if your work focuses on nature and biodiversity, are you thinking about the best energy options? If you come from the energy sector, maybe you're aware of the climate, the links, but are you considering your impact on nature? In fact, it's up to all of us to be aware of these links and to take the urgent action that really is becoming necessary. So I've been working in the energy sector for over 30 years now. promoting clean energy options, especially in developing countries. It's been recognized for some time that we need to stop using fossil fuels because of impact on climate change, which is now reaching critical levels. And renewables always seem to be the answer. But like most others involved with clean energy, I didn't consider the potential for any negative impact. In fact, renewables are a much better option than fossil fuels. And there's certainly great potential for offshore wind. But we need to recognize that any form of new power production is going to be disruptive to some degree. I remember my first few weeks at WWF coming from the energy sector, when I was told by my colleagues that wind turbines are a problem. They kill thousands of birds and bats every year. Hydro energy is also a problem because of the impact it has on fish, even the run-of-river hydro systems. And even solar causes a land use conflict with possible food production. So I thought then, goodness, all this renewable energy that I've been promoting for years, perhaps it's not as good as I thought it was, with all of these sort of impacts. In fact, for offshore wind in particular, there have been headlines such as wind farms taking grounds and damaging marine life, and fish are kept away by wind turbines. There are claims that offshore wind infrastructure has badly affected coral reefs. Certainly, they will cause some disruption. In fact, the submerged parts of offshore wind structures can act as artificial reefs, providing new habitats. But this is also likely to affect fisheries resources. So this needs careful assessment before any planning approval. Now, the key lesson must be to consider the right renewables in the right places. There's great potential for wind and solar across the planet, which can cover many times the global demand for electricity. So it makes sense to plan ahead, to consider all the options and decide which approach will cause the least damage to the natural environment. Renewable energy developers must give increasing attention to site selection and consider nature at the outset of any new project development. This is not just a nice thing to do so that we don't kill the birds or the fish or other wildlife. We need to consider the scale and the consequence of what is already happening. Climate change is now critical. Here at COP26 at the conference this week, this message is being heard loud and clear. But the lasting damage to nature of inappropriate energy sources is not yet receiving the same level of attention as the climate link. In fact, the loss of biodiversity will have critical consequences for all of us. There was a report at WWF that I came across. It was written a few years ago, showed that the wildlife biodiversity has decreased by 68% since 1970. I thought there was perhaps 2 or 3%, but 68%, that's a serious situation. A more recent report from the World Economic Forum showed that $44 trillion of global business, that's about half of GDP, has some form of dependence on nature. So the loss of biodiversity has not only damaging environmental impact, but also severe social and economic consequences. Now, the discussions leading up to COP and over the first few days here, they've shown that we are currently witnessing the next energy transition with a push for a rapid expansion of renewable energy sources. Therefore, now is exactly the time that we need to raise attention to the impact on nature of any new energy generation to ensure a stable and sustainable future for all of us. Offshore wind is one source of energy that has great potential. Wind energy is one of the cleanest and cost-efficient energy sources. The global wind power market saw its second largest annual increase in 2020, with offshore wind accounting for a record 10% of new installations. But we must recognize that decisions today related to wind farms have consequences for the next 20 or 30 years. So we must consider the related environmental effects and risks during the construction, the operation, and the end-of-life phases. So, for example, the noise pollution, habitat destruction, collision risks, and displacement effects. Solutions to this are not yet clearly defined, but one thing is clear. There are many organisations concerned and are committing internal resources to address the issue. Now is the time for us all to come together, share perspectives, experiences and expertise to ensure a common understanding and assessment of the best ways forward. I'm looking forward to hearing from other experts on the panel today regarding their involvement in this area. So thanks very much, and over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Dean. And we will be coming back to Dean for a short comment on the panel debate later. But now it's my great pleasure to welcome up some of our panelists who are here to share knowledge, to share ideas, and to start talking about some of the solutions that we can use when facing this issue. So I'm going to go first with Thomas Anker Christensen, the Danish Climate Ambassador. Welcome, and take a seat anywhere you want. Then I'm going to welcome up Morten Dyrholm, the Vice President of Vestas. Thank you so much for coming here today. Then I'll welcome up Yuri Artioli, researcher on spatial planning. Welcome from Plymouth. And now, lastly, my co-delegate on climate to the UN, Nadia Christensen. Please come up here. Thank you so much. Yes, take a seat. Well, as we've just heard from Dean, there is lots of different issues that take place when building and upscaling the energy and the renewable energy, especially when we're doing it offshore and we're doing it in areas where there is lots of biodiversity. But first I'm going to give the microphone to Nadia, and I'm going to ask you, who do you think shares the responsibility in thinking and incorporating these different issues so we don't end up running into another crisis while we're trying to solve the climate crisis? So I'll give it to you first.
I think this is a really interesting topic, especially because we see that the fossil fuel industry, they are actually much worse than renewable energy sources. So I think that it is really important to highlight that this is really not, any way of bashing renewable energy sources. The reason why we really like this debate is because we love renewable energy so much. And in many ways, we see this as the second wind adventure. In Denmark, we often talk about that we've been through a wind adventure as we have been part of developing, especially offshore wind, and that has, of course, been a tremendous invention and really beneficial for the global climate. But back to your question, I think that this is a shared responsibility between both governments and private sector, and in general, this is also something that we have practiced in Denmark, where the public-private partnerships is something that really plays a key role in our renewable energy transition and in our climate policies. So I, truly believe that this is something we can, share together and where we can find the solutions. But I think that we still need to have this dialogue, and we need to continue this dialogue to develop solutions and to demand biodiversity initiatives, also when we talk about renewable energy.
Nice, that was a really well put answer. I'm going to pass it on to Thomas. As Nadia just said, it's about building partnerships between the private sector, the public sector, how we spatial plan and so on. What are your thoughts on this as a climate ambassador and somebody who tries to build bridges between these sectors in Denmark and internationally?
Well, let me say at the outset that it's clear that climate and biodiversity are two sides of the same coin. It is about how we as mankind on the planet take care of our own habitat and our long-term presence in a better harmony with both planet and nature. And the real challenge, as Nadia is pointing out, is really how we, while we're trying to work our way out of one crisis caused by the way we as humans produce and use one type of energy, don't wade into a second one with a new type of energy. And this is a really complex issue where coexistence really is the key. The government's part of this is, of course, as a regulator, as a policymaker, and sort of to start out with, I would say that this is not only something we can tackle at Danish level, but something where we are also part of a European Union, and where these questions are really a European Union issue, and we have initiated a dialogue with the European Commission in a way to find out what our common approach to this should be, to this coexistence. And we have also launched an analysis within the Nordic Council, because at least our waters, where the offshore wind is not only an EU dimension, but we also have waters that go over to Scotland and Norway, and there's a sort of a wider Nordic dimension to this, and really we have to find the solutions and the guidelines for how we do this together with our neighbors.
Thank you so much. Well, as we can hear already, it's a quite complex issue, and there's many levels of it. But it also, sadly, a part of biodiversity crisis it isn't as known to the public in the same way as the climate crisis, because it is quite hard to understand. And because it's not as much on the forefront as politically, what does a big company like Vestas think now, and what are you looking at now when you are looking into the future of Vestas and how you're going to build your business? How are you thinking about how to protect biodiversity and assessing it when you go forward?
Okay, I'll try and get to that in some details, but I think the starting point for us in the energy side here is that we don't have a lot of time on our hands. We have to quadruple the amount of installations in wind alone within the next 10 years just to get us to some pathway to the Paris Agreement. Because otherwise we won't get the green electrons that will drive decarbonization of the rest of energy. And we have to do that fast. So that's the starting point, because forget about biodiversity if we are on a 3.2 degree pathway. Forget about it. So for us, there's a starting point that the climate crisis is the fundamental crisis that we have to solve. And we have to be careful that we don't slow down that transition, because we don't have that time. That said, if we don't find the right combination of biodiversity and transition, we will slow down. We have to improve in this area, because we've seen too many times now where energy companies, they can spend 8-10 years permitting a project, and then suddenly a biodiversity consideration comes in, and all of that planning and all of that investments is out of the window. And it scares off investors, and it really hurts the transition. So we have to get to a point now where biodiversity considerations are being thought in right from the get-go. And we become much more diligent in our environmental impact assessments from the very start. That has to happen now, because otherwise we're going to mess up the transition. It's super important. So we can do a lot from a technology point of view, from how we build the turbines, everything from how we position the blades to using artificial intelligence to make sure the blades stop spinning when there are migratory birds. There's so many things we can do and are doing. So there are technical solutions for some of it, but it starts with the environmental impact assessment and doing that thoroughly from the get-go.
Nice. Well, that was very interesting. I think saying that weighing climate versus biodiversity on a crisis level is a very provocative thing to say. I think probably a lot of NGOs would disagree. But I agree, we are in a hurry right now. We have to really upscale. And often when we have to hurry with an upscale and build a lot, for many researchers that can be a big red light. What do you think about this, Yuri? What are you concerned about in this upscaling that has to happen? Or do you have thoughts and inputs on how we can do it in a way where we can balance both things that we need to get a hold on?
Hi. I totally agree that there is urgency on the climate crisis, but at the same time there is the same kind of urgency on the biodiversity crisis, and I think that we can tackle or we can at least attempt to tackle and keep in mind both at the same time, and not just running with on one of those two crises, on trying to solve one of those crises, and forget about the other one and say, oh, we'll look at that later, because as he just said, then the two are very interlinked, and one then, if we don't address both, then that's a problem also for the other one. And I think that there has been already a lot of research trying to understand what are the potential impact. There are a lot of solutions that are already there. There is definitely a need for further research, because the more we know, the more we realize that there are other problems, and those problems can be studied while the expansion is going on. And it doesn't have to stop the building, but it has to be that the design of new offshore wind farm and the environmental impact assessment starts with including the science. I mean, there has been a lot of investment both from public and the private sector also to be at the forefront on understanding and addressing what are the potential impact and how they can be addressed.
Thank you. By the way, please be able, just mark when you're ready to say anything. But before we have a free-for-all, I would like to ask you, Thomas, as you are here a representative of the state and the authority, how do you see that you and your role and the authorities are going to work towards this? Or do you believe that it will be nationally we have to move first, or is it more on the international level that you see the most important to move right now in towards securing biodiversity while upscaling? Is it international standards? Is it through UN? Is it through EU? What do you see right now is the most important place to start in this work?
Well, I think for the wind industry to sort of exploit the potential that there is, and Morten talked about the need to scale up 4 times. It's maybe even more, Morten, isn't it? 7 or 10 times actually, if we really want to be ambitious. And as Morten says, in order for that to happen, we need to move really fast. But at the same time, we also need to develop ways to do due diligence that are facilitate this scale up while at the same time taking biodiversity measures. And one aspect there, and that's also why it can't only be in Denmark, is about the data, the kind of data, the quality of data that we collect, that we demand from the industry, but also from research and from our authorities. Where do we report it? Some of these issues related to biodiversity are covered by conventions that have certain rules with regard to whether it's migratory birds or fish or other species, and it's a quite complex set of different overlapping guidelines, and I think the more clarity we can have on the kinds of requirements, the kinds of due diligence that needs to be done, the kinds of permitting that is needed, the more we can also help ensure the biodiversity and the permitting at the same time. But as I said, that is not only a Danish requirement, but a more at least starting with a European or Nordic and European level, and probably at some stage we would have to have that even at a wider global scale. That's one question. The other is, of course, how do the governments, starting with Denmark, but then also others, actually go about the permitting process? Who is in charge? Which authority do you go to? Is there a one-stop shop, or do you, as an industry, have to go to 10 different authorities? And do we, as a government, also have an overview in one place of all the requirements and everything that is needed? I think the more you have a one-stop shop, the better you can ensure that the biodiversity criteria and measures are actually met, but at the same time also facilitating the dialogue with the industry. And we aspire to that one-stop shop model in Denmark, but also as we have this deep energy transition cooperation with currently 19 governments around the world, both developed and developing countries, and the model of having a one-stop shop for permitting for energy projects is one that we are in a dialogue with a number of countries about, also learning from, because again, one thing is that we might find solutions in Denmark that work, but with such a small country, with after all, a limited market and limited impact. But if we find a model that works well for both biodiversity and climate and the wind, we might also, in a way, help others to understand how that is and thereby actually help both biodiversity and scale up of wind.
Yeah, so I can hear sharing knowledge is key in this transition. I think it was Natya first and then you afterwards.
Thank you so much. So I think it's so interesting that Emma and I, as Danish youth delegates to UN, we have to work with both CBD and UNFCCC. And this is a really interesting combination because we often see that different UN systems are working in silos. So for example, we experience how at CBD, the Biodiversity Convention, they are working with, should we protect 30% of both land and sea? And that would of course be, really interesting from a biodiversity perspective, but that could be really harmful if you want to build out massively, as we have talked about before, as we need to do with regards to offshore wind. So I think that we really, come to the question of marine spatial planning and the fact that there is just simply not enough space if we are thinking about solving one solution at a time. But where I hope that we are getting as a society is also to a place where biodiversity and for that sake also resource use and other sustainability measures is part of what companies would compete on, because all the initiatives that you talked about earlier will probably cost money to invent new technologies and to develop them and for the technologies to mature. And this cost is not something that we can only, pass on to the companies. This is also something that we as societies need to dive into. So what I would hope for, and I'm not an expert in tender bids or anything like that, but I would still love to see that biodiversity criteria and sustainability like circular economy and resource use is part of the criteria that you're having as government and as other who is starting tender bids. And that is something that I think would be really interesting. And earlier on we've seen company competing on the price, and that has been the main one focus. So I hope that we're getting a place where we're having a new focus on what companies will compete on.
Nice.
I think that was a super good comment, and I actually want to take it a step further. Instead of saying, let's hope that societies and governments take this, why don't we just take an action item already now? That's action 1, that we take the initiative in a coalition of the willing. Great if you can help drive that, where we, from researchers, public side, us as private companies, we get together. And then we start the process to get those standards in place that you were talking about, Thomas, because that is missing. I mean, we know everything about wind. That's what we do. And we have great wind maps. We know exactly how much wind there is on every square centimeter on this planet. If we can overlay that wind map with a biodiversity map, if we can develop such a thing, we can speed up planning processes, develop standards for how we do that. Because the biggest problem we have in our industry is not financing, it's not technology, it is permitting. That's the biggest obstacle to the transition right now, slow permitting. And that could be really helpful for that challenge if we get something like this together and start developing that, because it is a missing piece. I mean, I know, as you say, there are lots of research here and there, but who brings all that together and work with the renewable industry to speed up permitting? If we can take an action item, I'll be happy to join on that one.
I had great hopes for this dialogue, but I think you definitely exceeded it. If this can be the start, but this was the idea, to start sharing, to start thinking about how we can do this and move forward. The two crises and the two interests shouldn't stop each other. So I'm very excited now. Something interesting is happening. That's very cool. Please go.
Yeah, I totally agree, and the fact is also that the problem is that there is definitely more information about the wind maps and less information about the biodiversity side. And that's because, as you said, that there are a lot of investors happy to pay for the wind farms and the wind, and unfortunately there has been a lot less funding to do actually biodiversity mapping. And also there has been a lot of research on this, But as in other meetings I have been attending here, there has been a lacking of continuous funding to actually continue to monitor changes in biodiversity, and we don't even have a map of the full or ocean sediments, for instance. So and until now, this funding has been lacking. So I definitely welcome and I definitely pick up the challenge on working together. And I think that the research community that probably until recently has been very much focused on just understanding biodiversity in a similar way that other people were only starting and trying to understand their own topic. We understand that if we want to be more effective, if we want to contribute more to solution, our research has to be co-designed with both the public sector, but also the industry. And I think that that's really the challenge that we have now, and that we're happy to address it.
So maybe the wind turbine sector has to start maybe giving some funding to be able to solve this solution. Maybe? What do you think?
First of all, I think we should let the fossil fuel companies pay for this. I mean,
yes.
Given the fact that how much biodiversity loss they have been, guilty of over the many years that they have been burning the planet. So I think 1% tax on all fossil fuel companies to pay for it would be the best. Of course, we will contribute here. I also happen to be the chairman of our Global Wind Energy Council, where we have all the industry players together, and I think that's the right place to put a proposal like this forward. So let's get this started. I'm ready to roll.
Morten, by asking for such a tax, you will find good allies amongst the small island development states and the LDCs who are similarly asking for that kind of tax to pay for loss and damage and building resilience and adaptation in the smaller islands. So maybe we see the contours of a new alliance here.
Well, it looks like we're solving many issues at once up in this dialogue, so that's awesome to hear. But maybe, do you think biodiversity also should be a bigger part of the work as a climate ambassador? Maybe when you hear some of these ideas and solutions that are coming here, is it something we maybe in Denmark also should focus in when we're making international deals and we're pushing for climate? Or what are your thoughts on this? This is just a question of my own interest.
Well, the two agendas are definitely overlapping. Because of the climate crisis, there is also a need to keep part of the climate agenda very focused on the climate issues that need to be moved at higher speed and scale. But when it comes to the solutions, and especially the overlap between also adaptation and biodiversity, I think the two agendas are very closely intertwined. And if you look at, for example, the sinks, the carbon sinks in nature that are defined in the Climate Convention, forests and the ocean, they are clearly also essential to biodiversity. And in fact, the reference that Nadia had to the 30% targets, are both on land and the ocean are directly intertwined. And in the negotiations, you will find that there is, for example, still no clarity on the role of the ocean in the climate talks, because many argue that that's in the Biodiversity Convention, whereas the role of the ocean as a sink is actually not addressed in the climate talks. You have no agenda item, you have no space where we talk about ocean as a climate issue. So that, it's not entirely clear yet how the two go together. And as you said initially, there is some silo thinking between the two communities, also driven by the fact that it's different negotiators. You have different organizations. So the Secretariat is in Bonn for the Climate Convention and in Montreal for the Biodiversity Convention. So they are simply not joined up in a way. They also have different SDGs, right? There's SDG 15 for biodiversity and 13 for climate and 14 for the ocean. So the way the whole thing is organized is not maybe entirely advancing the integration of the two agendas. So it's complex. Even in Denmark, we have the climate ministry is in charge of course, the climate convention, and it's the Ministry of Environment that is in charge of biodiversity. So it's also split among the two. But I think the appeal that you are making, that we should look at how better to bring the two in synchronization, is an extremely important point, and maybe one that governments should also think more about.
Thank you so much. To be honest, this whole panel is just making me extremely positive and excited, which is nice in the dark times of climate. So, but Nadia, if we're talking about, we can clearly see, we're all discussing here, that there is some kind of disconnect between these two issues. Do you have any ideas how you think we can start talking more together, from sector to sector, from research institution to research institution, from politics to politics, and different conventions? What is your view on it? I know it's a big question, but
I think that we need to have more dialogues like this, and this is also why that we really thought that this was beneficial, like having different people like meeting and actually getting together and finding and developing solutions. And I'm kind of regretting that there's not an NGO like WWF or something like that here, because they of course also need to be on board in this, and they need to be involved in a meaningful way, because obviously they have different perspectives that is also needed here. So I think that is really crucial. But as I also said, I think that the different UN silos, as I called it earlier, should really like break down those silos in a meaningful way. And I would wish to have like a COP where it's not COP15, the CBD biodiversity, or it's not COP26 where it's only climate, but where we're having a conference once in a while where we're thinking about how to solve more than one crisis. And now we have called this debate or this theme like two global crises interlinked. But in regards to like environmental sustainability, which is what I'm limiting myself to, we are like having at least 3 or 4 crises interlinked. We are also having a resource crisis, and this is not to go into a whole other debate, but also just to like give kudos to Vestas for having a goal of being totally circular by 2040, as far as I recall, which is also a really important goal to have. So this is an example of something else, and I think in general, what I hope that we are able to do at COP and at other conferences where we get together and talk, which is not enough, we also need to act. But what I hope to do, that we do at these meetings, is to think about the next steps. To think about the next step of like industries and where they need to go to develop further, so that we avoid in those situations where we're having one bird destroying a 400 gigawatt, or not gigawatt, megawatt, wind project. So I really hope that we would, really be better at looking more forward.
I very much agree. Do anyone have anything to add to it?
I mean, while I was listening to her, I was totally agreeing that the fact that, obviously, this panel, we're focusing on 2 crises, but as she said also earlier on, the space in the sea is limited, and we think when we look at from the shore and we look at the sea, we see this immense, vast blue area, and we say, oh well, we can do, and we can put how many turbines we want, and then we can also have the shipping line going around, and the fishermen, and I can continue to swim. But actually, when we start looking at how much space all these things actually require, we realize that there isn't that much space, and it's not just biodiversity and wind farm, but then it's also biodiversity, wind farm, and fishery, and it's also agriculture, because in some way, then what the river then brings down from land also affect everything else that happens in the sea. So all these things need to be in some way interlinked, and probably like it would be good to have once in a while like some joint conference or something like that. But I think that it would be probably more effective in the long term if actually the people that are in both conferences or that are focused either on climate or on biodiversity or on fishery and so on, they take a holistic approach and they try to look not just at the single thing, but also at all the other factors that can influence the specific bit that they are interested into. And then they start talking to each other, if it's either in a single event or in other fora. But I think that, that holistic view is really a critical thing to start using much more.
Thank you so much. Or do you have a comment?
Well, just to say that I mean, the third crisis I would pile on to you too is the crisis that the ocean is facing, and I mean that is not only due to ocean-based economic activity, but just as much from global warming. It's global warming that is leading to the bleaching of the corals. It's the acidity from CO2 that leads to the higher pH value in the ocean that leads to huge damage to vertebrate life in the ocean. It's the agricultural residues from the nutrients that go into the ocean that create ocean death and aphoxy, etc. I mean, there's just a long list of man-caused climate-related actions that lead to ocean death and to a very dire situation for the ocean. And next year we will also have the UN Ocean Conference, another big event that was put off because of the climate, because of the COVID pandemic. And in some ways that conference is the bridge between the two, and the one where also the situation of the ocean is on the table. And I think Morten and I, Vestas and the Danish government, working with the Global Wind Energy Council and the International Renewable Energy Agency, we are preparing the launch of a global offshore wind alliance that can look at how to drive collectively the rollout of offshore wind faster, bringing in both governments, industry, international organizations and finance. And maybe, Morten, when we have the right governments at that table, putting this question of the permitting and the criteria for how to roll this out faster. I mean, two sides of the same coin in a way, and also in a way enabling the industry to respond to the biodiversity criteria in a conversation with the governments on also do the scale up faster. These things are interlinked, and maybe that's an item we could also try to address when we have the right players at that table.
Well, Morten, you look like a happy man.
I am happy. I'm happy because we both have identified an action where we already have identified a place to put that action. So I think that's making progress here within 30 minutes.
Well, look at us. This panel could solve any solution, it seems like. Well, I think actually we've rounded all the questions I have. You've been a fantastic panel. I could not ask for anything more. So if there's anybody who has any last remarks, now's your chance. What? Oh, let's take a round then.
Maybe take a question from the
Or, that's also a good question. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Oh.
Probably more of a comment. I think my colleague Dean coming later is one from IPBES in Denmark. Is rushing into this extremely interesting panel. Exactly that linkage and the two sides of the coin, as you put it, Thomas, with regards to climate and biodiversity, is our focus. And I would just like to suggest, I mean, you were saying how can we connect it, Nadia, and I would say this is just a call out to the parties that we actually anchor nature into the COP26 text, because that is actually a way that we can make that connection. So that's a first. Sorry, I just lost that. Hang on a second. Yeah, and the second thing I just wanted to also say, we've talked about negative impact on biodiversity from renewable energy or energy expansion. But I would also say today, WF has launched a report where we look at the positive impact from the climate agenda on nature in our report on the NDCs and how they are embracing nature actually and recognizing the role of nature in the climate agenda. And what we can see is actually of the 114 NDCs, updated NDCs, actually 92% has some form of recognition or role of nature in them as part of the nations taking climate action. So just wanted to highlight also a positive note, but first and foremost, a call out to the parties to anchor nature into the COP26 text. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one more question before we go back to Dean. Is there anybody who has a question to the panel? Oh.
Yes, thank you very much, Lars Dinesen from IPBES in Denmark. I think one thing I might have been lacking in the Danish context is kind of strategic planning. So probably a number of projects have been ad hoc, and suddenly you have, as Morten, I think, said, an environmental barrier or something like that. But if you had data mapping and a strategic planning, it would be easier to do long-term planning and avoid these kind of situations. I don't know if the panel agree with
well, I don't know if you heard, but
just one further comment is that, for instance, wind farms, if you put them far out in the sea offshore, they usually do much less damage than if they are closer to the. So this kind of strategic considerations will be very useful.
Yes, Morten?
Yeah, that is true, and you can say from a technology point of view, it is moving far out to sea. That's the development, because what's coming now on a massive scale is floating wind. So we are liberating the turbine from the fixed foundations, and that means that we can push them out, and that also gives a little bit easier spatial perspective on where we can put the wind turbines. And because it's easy to install these turbines, you don't have fixed bottoms anymore. You can more precisely put them where you don't have migratory bird routes or where you have other issues. So technology will get us somewhere. But I agree on the mapping side. There's a missing link in that context.
But another technology that is also in focus is not only floating wind farms, but also wind islands, as the Danish government love to talk about. And there's, obviously a lot of good things about wind islands, but since they are so big, and now we're talking 12 gigawatt, which is enough to to supply energy for 12 million people. So really the double amount of how many people we have in Denmark even. But what is interesting about those energy islands is also that they contain a lot of sand and a lot of, other things that have to be imported from other places and can have immense impact on biodiversity and nature. And I think that the reason why I also think that this debate is interesting is that if we don't remember having biodiversity in our minds, then we can't, get to a point where we are forgetting that in the development of where offshore wind should go. So I hope that we're coming to a place where offshore wind is even, having a positive biodiversity impact, as it was also highlighted in the comments. And then I hope that when we develop new technologies, we're thinking about how can this have a positive impact.
Thank you so much. Anyone with a last remark? Well, then I'm going to say a big thank you. And thank you to all of us, or to all of you guys. Please give them a warm applause. Yes. And so, yes, exactly. We're going to go back to Dean now. But you can, I don't know where it's easiest to get down. So, Dean, I hope you're still on the line after this interesting debate. I'm looking forward to hearing your last comments.
Great. Can you still hear me okay?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Uh-oh. I can see myself, if that's any good.
Yes, now you're good. Please tell us
thanks,
what your thoughts are from hearing this debate.
I think it's such a great dialogue, a great conversation. I really sort of picked out 3 or 4 points which I'd just highlight quickly, but also perhaps a way forward that I can offer from a WWF perspective. So particularly was this continued dialogue and partnerships. I mean, that's clearly a critical issue. So we know that, as I said before, in some organisations that are traditionally focused on nature, work is ongoing that considers energy. There are not so many energy organisations looking at nature. So it's now time for us to join up and coordinate these efforts. We've all got to share experience to build on that, build on any existing activity that relates to energy or nature. Because only then can we move forward effectively and find the best future options. So in terms of renewable energy, I mean, including offshore wind parks, they're certainly better than fossil fuels, but clearly we need also to be aware of the potential damage to biodiversity. So all types of energy production, including offshore wind, are going to have an impact on the natural environment, and we've got to carefully monitor that. So I thought this whole issue that was brought up of permitting is absolutely critical. And I like this idea of a one-stop shop, which we hadn't thought about previously. So that could be something for us to consider further. Also, finance was mentioned, it's a critical factor. Whether we can have a 1% tax or some other sort of future arrangement, maybe sort of public sector can offset some of these costs. But clearly it's important that here in Glasgow we raise the awareness of the policymakers regarding the cost of failing to consider the impact of energy on nature. So in particular, there's a clear need, as was said also in the discussion, for advanced planning, just to select the best clean energy options, including the best sites for offshore wind. And great to hear that Vestas has got this mapped out. So it's not that it doesn't exist, it is all there, and something that we should be looking at. So this whole idea of environmental impact assessment, I think, yes, are needed, but perhaps we need to consider even more than that. It's this advanced planning, looking at, we've got spatial maps, we've got that sort of, the possibility to move this forward, and let's use that, use what exists already. So we're certainly looking at this. We're keen to work together at WWF with partners who recognise that the link between energy and nature is going to be a critical step to addressing this this urgent global challenge. So I was really pleased to hear this idea of a coalition of the willing. And on that note, I'd just like to mention now that we have a new coalition linking energy and nature for action, calling this Clean Action. And this coalition is going to play a key role to bring concerned organisations together to find immediate practical solutions. So Clean Action is going to be launched in the WWF Pavilion on Friday next week at 12 o'clock. So certainly we've got very common interests, and I hope that all those on the panel and the audience will join us next week to see the launch of the Clean Action Coalition. So thanks very much. Great to be here, and I hope we can take this forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dean, for some interesting and constructive points on how we move forward. I'll say thank you to you now, and thank you for your wonderful introduction and last comments. And I hope we speak during the next week when you're here at CUP.
Thanks very much, Emma. Bye then.
Bye. And now we'll be moving on to the second part of the event of the two interlinked crises. We'll be moving on to the part about nature-based solutions. And to start off this event, we're going to start with a short video, and after Lars Dinesen will give a couple of comments on the new report that has just been published. So, play the video, please.
We have always been inspired by nature's solutions when dealing with great challenges. But the approach to handle climate change is too often based on short-term solutions with heavy engineering. Nature can in fact help us with many of the challenges that climate change brings.
Nature-based solutions are inspired and supported by nature. They involve protecting, restoring, and managing ecosystems. We can use nature-based solutions in a manner that produces benefits for both biodiversity, climate, and welfare in the Nordic region.
The beauty of nature-based solutions is that while it helps us solve the problems at hand, such as biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, other areas benefit as a result. The Nordic region has already implemented nature-based solutions in various natural environments.
We need to see the bigger picture in order to learn from each other and scale up successful projects. We are funding a range of projects spanning from cataloging Nordic nature-based solutions to funding innovative pilot cases. We are also creating guidelines for national and regional implementation. We believe that by investing in this 4-year program, we will improve our toolkit to help make the Nordic region the most sustainable region in the world by 2030.
Perfect. What an interesting video. I'm looking forward to this second part of the event. Now I'll give the word to Lars Dinesen. Take it away.
There we are. Okay, super. You hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. I'm going to present you on nature-based solutions with a focus on peatlands and forests, and a focus as well on biodiversity and climate, and relate that to a number of Nordic case studies. I'm senior advisor in IPBES in Denmark. For those of you who don't know IPBES, it's an intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, where Denmark have a national hub financed by 5 Danish universities. The focus you see on the photos is on peatlands to the left, going from a degraded state to a more intact state, and from on the photos on forests, going from a production forest towards a more old-growth forest. So it's about restoring biodiversity and also benefiting climate. And this doesn't work. Oops. There we are. Thank you. I'll just start with the definition of nature-based solutions by the IUCN, which is actions to protect sustainable manners and restore natural and modified ecosystems in ways that address society challenges and benefit both humans and biodiversity. And we have the focus in our study, I'll present to you in a second, on the restoration of natural ecosystems and on climate change mitigation. So this is the report we have developed, presenting 8 case studies from the Nordic countries on nature-based solutions, and I'll give you a few examples of these cases in a second. I have developed the report together with Anders Højgaard Petersen and Carsten Rabeck from the University of Copenhagen and IPBES in Denmark, and it's a report, you can find it online, published by the Nordic Council of Ministers. So we provide a few policy options in the report. Here I'll present the 2 on peatlands. The first one is stop for new drainage activities of peatlands. This is essential to preserve natural carbon stocks and also to conserve unique biodiversity values. The second option is where you have drained organic soils, drained peatlands, to restore them in order to prevent emissions of carbon dioxide and initiate a long-term restoration process of biodiversity by rewetting these peatlands. And I'll provide a few examples of this. We have this case from Denmark, Lille Vildmose, a raised bog in Denmark, 55 square kilometers. And if you look at the top row of photos, this is a situation of drainage and deterioration of this raised bog during the last 250 years. For different purposes, energy, agriculture, and latest for horticulture. In the last decades, restoration have been ongoing by blocking numerous ditches in the bog and by building dikes with waterproof membranes and so forth to keep the water into the bog, delivering significant benefits for biodiversity and reducing carbon emissions with a rough estimate 10,500 tons carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So it delivers on both agendas. Another case is from Sweden, where restoration activities had targeted 35 peatlands in Sweden. You see, in this case, the picture to the left is before restoration, and the picture to the right, or photo to the right, is after restoration, after re-wetting, and after removal of invasive trees and shrubs. And again, it delivers biodiversity values in terms of bog indicator species, plants and birds, and altogether the reduction of carbon dioxide is roughly estimated to 19,000 carbon dioxide equivalents, carbon dioxide equivalents per year, and tons as well. So again, a quite, to put it simple, a simple solution, re-wetting and delivering on both agendas, both biodiversity and climate. A third and last peatland case is from Finland. As has been said previously, about half of the Finnish peatlands have been degraded, and of these 8,000 square kilometers now are low productive peatlands in a commercial meaning. So they are no longer commercial interesting for forestry. So comprehensive studies in Finland have looked at biodiversity and have looked at the greenhouse gas fluxes and come up with a number of land use options for these non-productive peatlands in commercial terms. And if we look into the land use options, a number will provide benefits both for climate and for biodiversity. No action, for instance, or ecological restoration where you restore the hydrology of these peatlands. Oops. So bringing that to the global level, we have about 3% of the global land area comprise peatlands. Only about 15% of this land area has been drained for different purposes, including agriculture and forestry. And these 15% is responsible for 4% of the human emissions of carbon dioxide. So the challenge is to re-wet these drained peatlands, and if you're going to comply with the IPCC reduction pathway and remain below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we need to restore about 25 million hectares before 2030. So it's a huge challenge in front of us, and that involves going into productive peatlands as well on agricultural land, on forestry land. Then we go to forests. We have a few cases on forests related to nature-based solutions. And here we have the two policy options for forest. One is strict protection of existing old growth forests, conserve remaining old growth forests, which will mean a stop of logging and which will safeguard biodiversity and contribute to climate change mitigation through the preservation of the carbon stock in these forests. And the other option is to restore degraded forest ecosystems and to allow these upcoming forests to develop towards natural old-growth forests. And old-growth forests are essential to biodiversity and contribute to climate and to ecosystem resilience. So one case here is from Denmark, where the government now have decided to set aside 75,000 hectares of production forest going towards old-growth forest, going to meet biodiversity targets. It might sound just a little, but Denmark is a small country, so it's actually a major leap in a Danish context to set aside 75,000 hectares. On the Danish map, you will see the purple is the state forest, and it's the state setting aside this area. The majority of the forest owners in Denmark are private, the green areas on the map, and they are still not involved in this exercise. And again, this activity deliver on both agendas, both the climate and the biodiversity agenda. Another case is from Norway, where deciduous forest is colonizing abundant agricultural land, and where we now have about 1,500 square kilometers of new forest in southern Norway and adjacent Sweden. And here nature-based solutions would be to allow these new forest stands to develop towards old-growth forest, delivering biodiversity already documented by increase in red-listed species, for instance, and research results does also find that both biomass above the ground and in the soil will increase. Obviously, you will have larger trees when the young forest stands grows bigger. And the last case is from Iceland, where you had about 40% of Iceland covered with birch forest before human arrival about 1,100 years ago. And all these forests have almost been lost due to human activities, creating erosion, and Iceland had to establish a land erosion service back in 1907 to cope with these erosion problems. It's an indication of the scale of the problem. Now we have the opportunity to restore this first ecosystem, set aside land for recolonizing with birch forest. On the top photo you see an area of about 800 square kilometers next to the volcano of Hekla, set aside for forest recovery. This is an opportunity to re-establish this forest ecosystem, and it is a modest but still a positive contribution to climate change mitigation. So I had taken the liberty to just highlight the promise here at this COP and the agreement to reverse deforestation by 2030, which is a major achievement if that's going to come true, and also come up with the warning that earlier commitments have actually failed to deliver. It's obvious that this commitment needs to be delivered upon, but if it's going to be delivered upon, it's a major achievement for biodiversity and also for the climate. And putting that into a Nordic perspective, you can say that the Nordic countries and Europe as such have a major ecological footprint on other continents, and through their import of, for instance, soya beans or palm oils and so on. So there is also an option, a policy option here to do something about trade in terms of minimizing biodiversity impact and and climate change mitigation in the way we are having our trade. So the last policy options I'm going to present, then I will hand over to the panel debate, is an option on restoration and Nordic leadership, where these two global crises, the biodiversity and climate crisis, provide an opportunity for Nordic countries to align with and take lead in meeting international targets and obligations through nature-based solutions. We have a quite high level of education, of democracy, and of resources, and will be able to actually to do that. And finally, a policy option on planning at large spatial scales, which will increase and facilitate both local and overall synergies between synergy and climate change, and also be a tool to involve local communities in decision making. So we are in front of a huge planning exercise, which involves also a collection of data and mapping, while we at the same time are picking up the low-hanging fruit, which I have exemplified in a few of these cases presented. So that was what I will say. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you, Lars. I just want to make sure that my mic is on. You guys can hear me? Sure. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a small panel debate on nature-based solutions. So I would like to welcome to the stage Daisy Hessenberger. Daisy is from International Union of Conservation of Nature. Welcome. And then I would like to see Øyvind Kristoffersen from the Norwegian Environment Agency. And Øyvind is on his way. And then last but not least, Halldor, and I'm sorry if I say your last name wrong, Thorgeirsson from the Icelandic Climate Council. Welcome. And we're going to use a shared mic, so in a little bit I will ask you guys to introduce yourself and then just pass the mic around. So this is really interesting. Now we've heard from the private sector, we've heard from the public sector on the whole planning issue. We've actually had from Lars some solutions, and now I want to talk a little bit to you guys about concrete nature-based solutions, because that is what you know about. So Daisy, you might want to start by introducing yourself and sharing a little bit on your perspective on nature-based solutions.
Absolutely. Hi everyone, and hello everyone online. Now, before I start, just please put your hand up if you know exactly who IUCN is.
Okay.
Wonderful. It's not always the case, and it hasn't been in the past, so it's absolutely a privilege, and thank you very much for letting us be part of this panel. So I'm Daisy Hessenberger. I work at the IUCN on nature-based solutions, and specifically our global standard for nature-based solutions. And if you know IUCN, you know our vision is a just future which values and conserves nature. How are we going to get there, though? Which is why, for us, nature-based solutions are part of this just transition to a sustainable future. Of course, we need to we need to decarbonize our economy, but nature-based solutions offer a huge opportunity to get to where we need to go. And I'm looking forward to, in this panel, exploring exactly how, and I think partnerships are a theme that came from the first panel, how we're going to get there. Thank you.
Maybe you can pass it on to Øyvind.
Okay, hello, I'm Øyvind Kristoffersen. I come from Norway, from the Environment Agency in Norway. I work very much also with the IPCC, and here I work for the Norwegian delegation. When it comes to the Norwegian side, in Norway we promote nature-based solutions to the climate crisis. It can be, increasing and enhancing and protecting the huge carbon storage that we have in the ocean, for instance, in the kelp in the ocean, and also in the forest and in the soil and so on. Furthermore, nature-based solutions are important for climate adaptation to reduce the risk related to storm surge, to heavy rainfall, flooding and avalanches and so on. So, and by nature, nature-based solutions are complex, and they also require sometimes a lot of area of space in a way. So it's important that we base these solutions on solid knowledge, because it can be applied in a harmful way or in a positive way. For instance, for biodiversity and so on. So the way we do this, we need to do it in a smart way. Thank you.
Thank you. And last from Iceland, yeah.
Yes, yeah, my name is Halldór. I'm chairing the Icelandic Climate Council. But sitting here, I was reflecting on kind of how my life's journey relates to this conversation. As a scientist working on the problem that was identified here in terms of bringing back carbon into degraded ecosystems in Iceland, I was asked as a science advisor to help the Icelandic government fight for the inclusion of land use in the Kyoto Protocol. And that was a real uphill battle. I won't go into that story here, but then it might be good for you to, in terms of putting my observations into context, I then worked for the UNFCCC on and helped with the negotiations of the Paris Agreement. And I also helped, after I retired from there, I helped the CBD work on building their approach to the negotiations, but of the post-2020 framework. But we have to be really honest here. Both of these conventions are fighting for their life in terms of demonstrating that they can actually deliver what is needed. And so it's a little bit of, in my view, dangerous to only look at, in an academic way, synergies among these two, because we are now going into a really critical period in basically history of mankind, to be really grand
and honest.
And neither of the objectives of the climate or biodiversity will be met if we continue to have a split brain on this. And so I just want to be, I hope with your permission, I want to be a little bit, not angry, but I really think we need to be very clear on the urgency of not only setting objectives, but learning, figuring this out. And that is something that we have to do very fast. And so this is why I welcome the focus on nature-based solutions. Admittedly, it's a little bit of a climate term. It was coined from the climate side. And so my main concern specifically about nature-based solutions, when they are being applied, you cannot judge them only on their climate delivery. And this is one of the case studies that was very well presented in the report just presented, and I looked at it this morning. I was quite pleased with the way it was done, where basically these two objectives actually come to a head in a sense. Should you go for should you restore ecosystems that are fast at delivering climate outcomes, or go for options that are actually better for climate in the long run and actually maintain biodiversity at the same time? But there is so much educational challenge here, and I think that's something that we need to really maybe talk about. How do we actually help not the nerds? I mean, we are the nerdy people here. We know what this is all about, but it's really, there's a huge communication challenge. Sorry to go on for so long.
Well, I'm actually really happy that you mentioned this, because what I put down on my paper when we had the other talks was I actually wrote branding issue, and I mean the climate. The climate people have Greta Thunberg. We all know her. We all know what she stands for. Me, myself, I used to be a scout when I was a little girl. But as you say, biodiversity and nature tends to be this kind of nerdy thing. And when we have people from like Vestas up here talking about time, and time is an issue, do you guys think that biodiversity has a branding issue, and what can we do to give biodiversity the same attention as the climate change?
I think that this is two sides of the same coin in a way, and one issue is also that you know if we continue with climate change, we will have huge damage of the biodiversity itself in a way. So we need to reduce the emissions in order to prevent this biodiversity crisis. I think also when it comes to branding, I think in the Nordic countries, you know, people are very familiar with nature. We use the nature in many different ways. I think we have an advantage there. So I think it's, of course, it needs some education when it comes to the biodiversity. It's not just the forest, you know, it's also the different species in this forest. Sometimes it can be just one type of trees and so on. So we need to educate people that we need to keep this biodiversity also in the nature and so on. So, but and then I think these issues are complex, and as Haldor say, we need to. It's important not to jump to very easy conclusions in the short term, because we need to do it in the right way, and that is a need. For instance, when we do restoring peatland in Norway, we have research connected to this project, and restoring peatland. Drained peatland is really cheap in a way. It's just to, you know, block some of the ditches in a way. So that's very cheap compared to many other options. But we need to do it in the right way. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm glad you brought up branding, and not just because we've recently branded a nice logo for nature-based solutions at IUCN, but because one of the challenges that we know exists is the lack of speaking the same language. You know, Vesta up here. This morning I was at a renewable energy and offshore and biodiversity event at the Scotland headquarters. And we need to be able to not go in and just tell people about biodiversity, but speak to them in a way that matters to them. And to a private sector, large corporation, maybe that does mean speaking profits and you know, bottom lines. But going to a local community, it might be speaking about protecting their children, or, you know, making it easier for them to live. And equally, when you go and talk to indigenous people's organizations, it might be about land reform, or, you know, listening rather than talking to them or at them. So not just branding, but that communication, that translation barrier, which is why I think an event like this is great, because at the core of that, the way we get through that is through relationships and partnerships. This event has called for partnerships. One of the ways that IUCN operates to mainstream nature-based solutions, and not nature-based solutions that are just greening and not thinking about biodiversity and people at their heart, but real nature-based solutions that work with the local communities, that start with IPOs at the very beginning. One of the ways we do that is by partnerships with projects like Network Nature, bringing together all the different European nature-based solutions from the European Commission. It's those kind of learning together moments that I think can defeat this branding issue of nature-based solutions, I think, is the answer to the branding issue of biodiversity.
Amazing. So I know, just because I know that, Øyvind, you have a tight schedule today. So before we move on, I just want to ask you, in Norway, could you give some examples of exactly this? How do you go about promoting nature-based solutions, and how did you how did you succeed in implementing nature-based solutions in Norway? Can you maybe give a couple of examples on that?
Maybe I can explain a little bit. It was in the previous talk. It was discussion about the silos, you know, and I agree it's important to build bridges between these silos. One example in Norway is that, for instance, when it comes to the IPBES, the nature panel and the climate panel, IPCC. I'm focal point for IPCC, and we have also the focal point in our organization for IPBES. So we work closely together, and for instance, we have initiated and proposed activities in both panels about, you know, interlinkages between biodiversity and climate change. At the same time, they have their own schedules and they are very busy and so on. So it's building on step by step. But they have had now, for instance, a workshop and a producer report about these interlinkages. So that is one example. Another example is maybe that we work with the terms, you know, what do we call it in Norwegian when we translate? For instance, IPCC, we call in Norwegian FN's Klimapanel, which is much more understandable in a way. And we don't talk about biodiversity or biodiversitet in Norwegian, but naturmangfold, for instance, and so on. So how we translate the terms, and because these terms can be, and like, you know, the definition you had on nature-based solutions is so long, you know, so it's challenging. So yeah, that's one example. Thank you.
And then you had a comment, yeah?
Well, I have a comment first on the branding question, and I think first of all, this notion of biodiversity is very abstract and very difficult to fathom. And so we really need to be talking much more just on life on Earth, nature, and so that's one point. But we also need to be clearer on what is out there that are the drivers of these things that we're dealing with, and move out of these kind of abstract notions. And I would just want to take one example globally. If you look at it from a climate perspective, about 1/3 of all global emissions are in one way or another connected to the food system. At the same time, the food system is the key driver of biodiversity loss. But it's also, you can turn it around. In terms of the vulnerability of the food system, it's actually climate change, and we are also experiencing, and FAO has demonstrated this, that agricultural productivity is declining because of biodiversity loss. And so branding needs to change, because a lot of people, when they hear of this thing, they think of iconic species that might be lost. But what we need to really worry about is life that nobody sees, like in the soil. And so this is where I think there's a huge branding issue. You asked about how this thing is developed back in Iceland. As was mentioned here, Iceland was actually the first nation in the world to establish a soil conservation service, and this was actually one of the first laws that were ever passed after independence from the Danish kingdom. And so it's very much ingrained in the national psyche that we owe a debt to. So there's a lot of interest in restoring things. But we now need to do this a lot faster. And I must admit that I've been quite disappointed with the restoration of wetlands, because there's a lot of effort to make that happen. But there has been a bit of a delay in terms of like farmers committing to contracts with a fund that is restoring this. And there is, in too many people's minds, there is a wait for this glory of the carbon market that's going to make everybody rich. And if again I can be honest with you, one of the things that I think has really delayed our work, for example, on reversing deforestation and on some of the reclamation, is this over-insistence on monetizing it immediately in terms of carbon markets and other. And I don't get me wrong, I really believe that emissions trading and carbon markets are a part of the solution, but you first need to go through the really understanding the system. And that's why it was very wise for the RED process, the reducing emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, started with a preparatory phase. And so I think that it's really important that we find ways to accelerate these processes without jumping too quickly to very simple solutions and that can actually have perverse outcomes.
Great. So it's really interesting that you talked about soil preservation, because this year's Nordic Council Environment Prize, 2 of the nominees were regenerative projects in Finland and in Sweden. So we can see that there is this understanding that, especially within the food system, we also need to think about soil health and biodiversity. So what I was thinking was that a couple of days ago we were visited by the Finnish finance minister, who told that this year's COP is the first time that finance ministers are actually taking part in the discussions. So do you think that next year or a couple of years from now we will also see environment ministers and the biodiversity be part of the COP negotiations or be part of the integrated discussions at COP?
Well, that's a great question, because for anyone here who's worked with different ministries, just getting 2 different ministries in the same room can be a huge challenge and therefore a great win. Just personally working at IUCN, it's easy to question, what's the unique value of the organization that I'm working for? There are so many. But one thing I've seen proof of is our convening power to get different ministries in the room, because there's a long political history, there is a long, as well, just competitive history for resources. There's good reasons for them not to work together. And I think that's really changing. We've been able, for example, with our relief kit project, to get, I think it's over 30 ministries into one room, both environment and at least one other, to talk about ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, which is a type of nature-based solutions. So if we don't think it's possible for the finance and environment ministers to be there, then it won't happen. So I'm going to say I do think it'll be there happening at the next COP, and I hope so.
Yeah, and I think that that this is of course important, but this is going on in a way. I mean, it's a lot of cooperation between the different ministers and the different ministries and so on. So at least in the Nordic countries, I don't think that is the main problem. The main problem is more the priority, So we need to prioritize climate change and of course, the other ministries, they have many issues to take care of, and it's important that climate change is prioritized and given the priority when it comes to budgets and all these issues. But I really think we should not. I think, like in the Nordic countries, I think the ministries, they talk together, but they have just different objectives. Thank you.
I will actually have a little bit of a dissenting vote here because, and this comes, part of my gray hairs are having gone through a lot of these discussions, but I really want to make it very clear that coherence starts at home. You cannot expect the intergovernmental process to create that coherence. And this is why I think it's so important that there is this national conversation. And it cannot be just between ministries. It has to be very much involving the general public and landowners and indigenous peoples. And for me, the best entry point for that now, because we are opening up a new conversation, is that all countries are moving towards net zero. And we're doing this now with the Icelandic Climate Council, is to trigger a conversation, and I will put this in the Icelandic context, to ask people what type of climate neutral or net zero Iceland do you want to create? And so I think it has to be a much more focus on the local visioning, the local dreaming about the future. It's going to be very difficult to have more coherence at the intergovernmental level. It's fine to have it, but the coherence has to come from home and also from the problem itself and the solutions. And this is why I would rather focus on really learning from the success stories to multiply them, but we really have to have a kind of a systems thinking on this. We've talked about climate and biodiversity, but it's hugely important also to think of water in this context.
Just while you have the microphone, you mentioned success stories. Can you share a success story on nature-based solutions from Iceland? Do you have concrete examples of an area where you succeeded in implementing nature-based solutions?
Definitely, but we didn't call it that. There is very significant experience in Iceland. What I would perhaps wish to highlight is that the largest association in Iceland in terms of number of people participating is actually the tree planting or the reforestation association. What actually took it very much to the next level was when then President Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, the first female elected head of state, took it on as her focus. Wherever she would go, she would plant 3 trees, one for the boys, one for the girls, and the third one for future generations. And she also connected this very much to the culture. So I think it's hugely important that you kind of motivate people through something that they feel care deeply about. So, but we're still learning. One of the special characteristics in Iceland is that the soil that is very erosive, it's a volcanic soil, also immobilizes carbon very effectively. So you can actually store a lot of carbon below ground. But there are some challenges around quantification. So yes, there are success stories, but we are still learning quite a bit. But what maybe is our proudest part is that we have now been able to offer a United Nations training program in ecosystem restoration. So we bring people from all parts of the world to come to Iceland and work on ecosystem, learn to deal with ecosystem restoration, a similar way to what we shared our experience on geothermal.
That's really cool. Yeah, and a comment?
Yeah, and first of all, that is a wonderful course. I know it well, so good plug for the UN course on ecosystem restoration. I'm going to give you an example of success, my favorite one from my own country. But you said, Holder, that yes, we have examples of successful nature-based solutions, but we haven't called them that. And you hit upon a really key issue. Because we keep saying we need to scale up nature-based solutions, we need to finance them, which means we need bigger ones across whole regions, we need to learn from each other. But if you search for nature-based solutions in Iceland, or my example, nature-based solutions in the Western Balkans, even though they're acting on the ground, I can't find them because they're not labeled as such. There is power, and that's the power of the word nature-based solutions, to gather under its umbrella all of the different approaches that are based on the ecosystem approach. And so, using one of our pieces of work, the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, we've been able to go out, identify strong nature-based solutions as well as their weaknesses to be improved upon. So the one that I wanted to highlight is at the bottom of this of the UK, the Medmurray Coastal Realignment Project, where by realigning some of the coast and focusing on ecosystem restoration and management, they managed to protect 100 homes from flooding in the last 15 years, saved a bunch of money in terms of minimizing costs, but also driving a bit of the local economy. We've assessed it with the standard. It's a very strong nature-based solution. It's a beautiful nature-based solution. So I just wanted to highlight that one there.
Amazing. Cool. Okay, so what I hear from you guys is, first of all, we have to include people. We have to show them the difference that nature-based solutions and focus on biodiversity will give them. We also have this wording, branding issue. We have to both tell it like it is, but also show what difference it makes. Then the third thing I want to ask you about now is this cost benefit. Because as we also heard earlier on, there was a lot of talk about time and effectiveness and getting things done quick. And the thing about nature-based solution is that you won't always see the effect immediately. But also studies have shown that the cost benefit on the long term will actually prove that nature-based solutions can be quite positive. So what are your thoughts on this whole cost benefit discussion, and how can nature-based solutions be spent in a bit more positive way when people are mostly thinking short term?
So glad you asked that. I said that's one of the hard questions around nature-based solutions out there. And like I said, data is powerful when it's able to be shared and compared. So once we can identify all these different nature-based solutions out there, we're going to have stronger evidence about cost effectiveness. But yeah, it's a tricky question, and I wanted to say that nature is being included in cost-effective analyses, but in specific places and in key chambers it's not being included. But we do have the tools. We have the cost-effectiveness criteria and guidelines. We have some great examples in IUCN, great work with things, especially in water basins, where it's very easy even to visualize in our little human brains how a water basin's cost and effects up and downstream can act. So we shouldn't lose hope just because cost effectiveness is this big, scary word that for a lot of projects is hard for them to... They think these giant projects, by especially the private sector, have all this power of finance and economy. They have the beautiful cost-effectiveness analyses, and some people feel left out of that conversation because they think, well, how can I pour the same amount of resources to be able to go to my, Ministry of Planning and say, hey, the cost of action here is greater than the cost of implicating a nature-based solution. But we have the tools. We can learn from each other, and we can end up saying that nature-based solutions are more cost-effective in the right places. But yeah, interesting to hear where you think I'm being too optimistic.
Well, not at all. But I just want to make one point first, is that in climate, it's extremely difficult to do good cost-benefit analysis because we have good numbers on costs, but very limited understanding of benefits. And benefits are much more difficult to quantify. So that's a cautionary note here. And very often cost-benefit analysis is used to stop things happening rather than actually making them happen. So that's a cautionary note. But in terms of the specific analysis of nature-based solutions, in my view, it would be extremely important that we are clear on what are the processes that we are putting in motion. And then you would start some of the monitoring on if those processes have actually started and not only look at the final outcome. And if I take it from a kind of a carbon management perspective, people want to know, well, what's the ton per hectare? So I think it would be very important that we don't chop the task into too short periods, because the most cost-effective means deal with climate change, and that's not just in climate nature-based solutions, but generally, the most cost-effective actions all take time. But and so it really comes down to the discount rate and how you are you looking at what you have in the bank by 2030, or are you looking at the ecosystem processes that you have put in motion or reversed if they're negative that are going to bring in huge fluxes in the next 10 years. So I think it really comes down to the framing of the cost-benefit analysis.
Great. Yeah, you have a comment?
No, I absolutely agree. It's putting value on the process rather than the output, and that's something that we've also heard from the community out there. We're not just saying that to you today. Everyone I've talked to from Nature-Based Solutions, a lot of people understand we've got to be able to create that value in between that final, magical output that so many people demand. And there's lots of different ways of going about that.
Great. Okay, so we're actually running out of time. So I just wanted to give the opportunity to the audience here in Glasgow. If you have any questions, now is the time. Otherwise, I think we will begin to wrap up. I really liked your final point here, saying that the most cost-effective solution is the one that takes time, and that's a great way of looking at it. Even though we all know that the climate change and also the biodiversity crisis is something we have to face right now, then some of the most efficient solutions will also take time. So just to wrap up, Emma will join us back on stage. So thank you too for a great debate.
Yes, I have gotten the pleasure of wrapping up this really interesting 2-hour event. And I hope that you saw through both panels and the different speakers and what they've said that biodiversity and climate and the two crises that are happening right now are interlinked in many ways. And also that it can both have a positive and a negative effect on both biodiversity and climate, no matter what different things you're trying to solve. So I hope that this event opens the dialogue and opens the time for us to start thinking these two things together. So, as we also said in our earlier debate, so we don't end up running into a new crisis even more when we're trying to solve another. So thank you to all of our amazing panelists, and thank you to Nordic Council for letting us be here, Nordic Minister Council, and thank you to Jona and Siga and Nadja for being a part of planning this. So thank you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Friday, and you keep thinking about biodiversity the rest of COP.